factor. So we need less politics or more ownership by our decision makers. The politicization of peacemaking has intensified in ways that are not all that hard to identify. Go back and read the speech by George Bush, for example, Bush the son. We say Bush 43 in Washington, but in the Middle East they say Bush the son. You know, everything's family-oriented. Read his speech at the Knesset for Israel's 60th. We're doing Israel's 70th right now, but for Israel's 60th. He gives a speech that jabs not his opponent, but the Democratic candidate for president. He's in the Knesset speaking at an Israeli commemoration of its founding, and he's inserting American presidential politics into the speech. And I can give you many other examples. Our two political parties, and I think Tammy will touch on some of this, are also developing different approaches. We have politics seeping in virtually every facet. Now, you can't eliminate it, but it can be managed. There are enough examples that show when our decision makers, presidents or secretaries of state, are motivated, and they can make a case, and they spend some time talking to Americans, not just to the parties, that you can get people to kind of hold their breath, sometimes hold hands, and give you space. John Kerry, for his, albeit brief, peace process that he launched 2013 to 2014, plenty of problems, no doubt, but he spent a lot of time in the spring of 2013 conditioning audiences, American domestic audiences, Jewish Americans, Congress, and talking to Israelis and Palestinians themselves in the public. And you can get beyond the politics. Bill Clinton at Why, the choreography of getting that agreement. It wasn't just the negotiations inside the room. He spent a lot of time trying to manage politics. Third, I said more substance. And here, perhaps most controversially, we argue in the book, and I would say it's still relevant today, that if we showed a greater willingness to stake out clearer positions, the US, not just on the traditional final status issues that the insiders talk about, Jerusalem borders, as my kids who are now not little kids, they're becoming big kids, would say, yada, yada, yada. Not just these traditional issues, Jerusalem borders, refugees and all that, but also the culture of peace, to have a little bit of a wider agenda in terms of what peace should look like. The more we could do that, it forces leaders to make choices rather than dodge. It shapes public discourse. It helps bind us together with other actors out there, whether they're regional players like the Arabs or donors like in Europe. And perhaps most importantly, because I'll be the first to admit that conditions for peace aren't necessarily ripe today. It'll take some time, but it also gives us a framework for dealing with day-to-day issues, rather than sort of making it up as we go along. There are so many day-to-day challenges, issues of settlements, security, incitement. It's a long, long list. And when you approach them without a clear framework of where you want or expect or believe the parties should get to, it's hard to come up with a consistent approach, and it's hard to sell your approach. Bill Clinton came to the realization that we need more substance very, very late. In fact, it's the last 3 weeks of his administration he puts out his peace plan. It was too late. Bush and Rice, Condi Rice, they come to the same realization, but they're even more gun shy. And rather than put out a plan, Condi Rice put down the modest areas of progress from the process that she presided over. She put it down in a classified summary that sits gathering dust in the State Department. I did have a chance to read it. It's fascinating. But she wouldn't put it out. President Obama, it was before I'll blame Tammy because I wasn't in. She was in the government at the time. President Obama stepped up to the plate, but quite gingerly in 2011, May. The timing is kind of crazy. It had to do with the Arab Spring. But he gives a speech in May 2011 and steps up kind of gingerly, rather than addressing all the issues that divide Israelis and Palestinians. He broaches a couple of them and then appears to walk back. John Kerry gives a speech very late, but the world's sort of tuned out. I don't even remember the date. In fact, I remember watching it I was living in Israel at the time. In our living room, the Israelis were covering it live. Of course, an American leader speaking about the future of their country always gets you live coverage, and they cut the coverage halfway through the speech. People were kind of tuning out. Am I naive? Sure, you could call me naive. Is there a leadership deficit in the region? Do we have leaders going off to fantastic places like Norway and cooking up peace deals? No, we don't. Are the Israeli-Palestinian issues incredibly complex from a negotiating perspective? Absolutely. It's a lot harder than drawing a line in the Sinai Desert between Israel and Egypt. Is the strategic environment less compelling, Is this not a key to unlock some meta struggle or gain advantage against our adversaries like it was for Kissinger or later for Jimmy Carter? Yes, it's a less compelling strategic environment. All these things are true, but I still believe that there's a lot, we could do a lot better in terms of getting back to Arab-Israeli peace. We've done better before, and we can certainly do it again. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Well, I think this is wonderful because in many ways what we're going to be doing, what I'm going to be doing is kind of building off of the panel that we held right before lunch, and both of the previous speakers on this panel. I have to just start with an anecdote because Bob mentioned something that occurred when I was in the State Department that was extremely terrifying. And I think is really emblematic of Obama's commitment to Israel and its interests and its security. So Egypt had just gone through a revolution in which a 30-year ally and partner of the United States was overthrown by a popular uprising and ultimately by the Egyptian military. And the Egyptian military was in charge of Egypt. And when this riot began outside the Israeli embassy in Cairo, this was in the context of tremendous questions about whether Egypt would be able to sustain its peace treaty with Israel, its commitments to Israel in the wake of the revolution. Field Marshal Tantawi, who was the titular head of the interim government, didn't really know what he could get away with in terms of public opinion. It was an incredibly delicate moment. This riot went on for an entire night and a day. And the protesters actually scaled the walls of this office building, broke in the windows, got into the outer office of the Israeli diplomatic mission in Cairo, and Israeli diplomats were trapped behind an armored door in the back part of their embassy, while the rioters outside were working on breaking down the door. And Tantawi was not intervening. He wasn't sending in police or army or anything. And it actually did take that phone call from President Obama to put him where he needed to be and save the lives of those Israeli diplomats. So I remember so clearly the intensity of that period of time, the danger that was at hand, and a critical role that the United States was able to play at a critical moment. But that is not what I'm here to talk about. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some things that have come up already over the course of the day, the challenges to democratic health in Israel, a democratic discourse in Israel. We see parallels here in our own public conversations. And what does this shift in politics at the domestic level mean for the bilateral U.S.-Israeli relationship? What does it tell us about what may be changing in this relationship, where this relationship may be going? And I want to start out by emphasizing that Americans support Israel by and large. They don't only sympathize with Israel relative to the Palestinians in their conflict, which is the poll question that gets asked every year and gets a ton of press, and Bob cited it as well. That statistic is often cited as a proxy of American support for Israel. But in fact, if you look at things like